Hi. Thank you all so much for coming tonight. This is such a fantastic crowd. We've got a few additional seats available up here at the front, so feel free to settle in. Hi, wow, wonderful. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight. My name is Amali and I'm the events director here at Books on Magic. We are so excited to have Maya Binyam and Adam Dalva with us tonight to celebrate the launch of Maya's debut novel, Hangman. But before we get into all of that, I just have a few logistics to point out for how tonight's event is going to go. First off, we will be doing a hand-raised audience Q&A towards the end of the discussion, so please start thinking of questions to ask and hold on to them. After the talk tonight, Maya will be signing and personalizing books at the alcove next to where you checked in. We'll let you know where and when to start lining up for that. And lastly, if you're joining us virtually on the YouTube live stream, we would love to encourage you to buy a copy of Hangman online using the link in the live stream description. All right, let's get into this. Hangman reveals a strange, vaguely familiar yet unknown world where the unnamed narrator is attempting to find his way through his homeland to his dying brother. With striking prose and an intoxicating absurdity, this novel explores themes of belonging and exile, diaspora and connections, and the endless cyclical search for meaning and purpose in everyday life. Maya Binyam is a fiction writer and critic whose work has appeared in the Paris Review, The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, Book Forum, Columbia Journalism Review, The New York Times Book Review, and elsewhere. She is a contributing editor at the Paris Review and has previously worked as an editor at Triple Canopy and The New Inquiry. She lives in Los Angeles. As I mentioned earlier, Adam Dalva joins Maya in conversation tonight. Adam's writing has appeared in The New Yorker, The Atlantic, The Paris Review, and The New York Review of Books. He is the senior fiction editor of Guernica magazine and is an assistant professor of creative writing at Rutgers University. All right, that's all from me. Without any further delay, please join me in giving Maya and Adam a very warm welcome.
And I think we're going to start with the reading.
Thank you all for coming. Is this volume okay? Okay, cool. Yeah, I'm gonna read a little bit. I'm gonna keep it brief. I'm just gonna read from the first chapter, so hopefully you won't need any context beyond what was already so beautifully described. I'm gonna do a little bit of compressing, so there's a little bit of jumping around, but yeah, hopefully it'll make sense. We'll see. In the morning, I received a phone call and was told to board a flight. The arrangements had been made on my behalf. I packed no clothes because my clothes had been packed for me. A car arrived to pick me up. The radio announced traffic due to an accident involving a taxi cab driver, a police officer, and a woman whose occupation the dispatcher did not specify. But there was no traffic. My ticket was in the breast pocket of my jacket, which was handed to me as I exited the passenger door. Waiting in line, I felt I had no body, but by the time I reached security, I was hungry. Inside my carry-on, I found 2 apples and a croissant, which tasted like nothing. The security agent asked me for my name. I gave him my driver's license, walked through the metal detector, and then my body went away. Before takeoff, a flight attendant announced our destination. Everyone cheered. The passenger to my right asked if I was happy to be going home. He didn't speak our destination's national language, which had become the language of the plane. I told him that I was neither happy nor unhappy. He said he understood where I was coming from because his work had introduced him to people like me. He said that people like me had changed his life. It was true that they needed money, but the fact that he gave it to them had nothing to do with what they meant to him. His real life, outside our destination, was complicated by ambivalence. Since childhood, his basic needs had been met as if by an invisible force. At first, he believed his mother and father were providing for him, but when they died, he was surprised to feel that he had suffered no loss. Care, he realized, didn't originate within his parents, whose protection remained palpable in almost everyone he encountered. Waitstaff, his internist, even the Prime Minister. It had merely taken up residence in their bodies, which he didn't need to visit because the cemetery had nothing to do with the rest of his life. He looked cautious when he mentioned that word, cemetery, as if he had accidentally said a slur. When he was done worrying about being offensive, he moved on to talking about his wife. Things had come to her easily. As soon as they got married, she wanted children, and then she gave birth to 2. She considered recipes to be extraneous. Instead, she ordered cooking magazines and then reproduced the food on the cover page from sight. He had no use for leftovers because his office provided a catered lunch. Everyone he worked with had been elevated to the status of a boss. They made a lot of money, but weren't fond of discussing it, especially not with people like me. He appreciated the fact that people like me didn't have desires. His desires felt paralyzing because they weren't motivated by need. Everything was available to be possessed, which made it impossible to quantify an object or person's relative allure. He wished he felt more lust for his mistress. I tried to relate to him and understand his concerns. After takeoff, I unbuckled my seatbelt. A flight attendant asked if I preferred coffee or tea. I thought about it, but didn't think I had a preference. She tried another language. When she said it like that, I realized I preferred coffee. The man to my right asked for sugar, and the flight attendant asked if I wanted sugar too. I said no, and then she switched languages again and gave me sugar anyway. The coffee was delicious. The man to my right spit it out. After an hour, the ocean was the size of my window. I looked at the other passengers. Everyone was asleep except the man to my right, who was watching a film on a portable DVD player. On the screen, a strange man with a bald head was standing on a street corner. A woman with a stroller walked by and he asked her to stop. She didn't want to stop. I think she was worried for her baby, who wasn't on screen, but who was supposed to be in the stroller. The man said to hold on a minute. The man said he had a question for her, and her face became open. He said, "Do you belong to anybody?" She looked flattered. I think she thought the question was specific to her, but when she walked away, he just did the same thing to the next person, who wasn't even a woman. The next person was a teenager riding a bike. He didn't stop, so the bald man yelled out the question. The teenager rode away, and no one else was around to hear. Everyone was ignoring the strange bald man. He started to look lonely, and then he walked to a movie theater. He sat there and watched a movie about people having sexual relations. When it was done, he decided to walk across the city in a straight line. It didn't matter if there were obstacles. He got to a fence and climbed it, then jumped off on the other side. He got to a building, and the security guard told him to show his credentials. He said, "Do you belong to anybody?" The security guard didn't answer his question, but let him go through. The strange bald man climbed up the roof, walked onto the roof of the next building, and then he fell. I didn't think the movie was supposed to be over, but the DVD player announced that it was going to sleep. I looked at the man to my right. I was hoping he would say something to make it wake up. His eyes were open. I said, "Excuse me?" No answer. To be fair, I had watched his personal movie without permission. He might not have liked that. I decided to close my eyes, and then I fell asleep. When I woke up, the flight attendant was asking the man to my right if he preferred chicken or fish. He didn't say anything, which I could relate to, because I also didn't have a preference. If the fish was fresh, I would have preferred that, but I assumed it had been previously frozen and then cooked in some kind of unidentifiable oil, so comparing it with the chicken, I had no preference. I was thinking about that when the flight attendant began to scream. I couldn't understand what she was talking about. I thought she must be having a personal problem. I turned to the man on my right, wondering if he could understand what was happening with the flight attendant. His eyes were still open, and his head was slanted to an extreme degree. The flight attendant switched languages and told me that the man to my right was dead. Another flight attendant asked me if I knew the man's name. I told her that I knew about his problems with his desires, but to please excuse me, for I had not thought to ask for that information. They made an announcement and asked if there were any doctors on board. Unfortunately, there were none, so a third flight attendant arrived with a first aid kit. Inside, there were bandages and medicated creams, nothing to help a dead man. I wanted to ask to move to another seat, but wasn't sure that would be the right thing to do. I stayed sitting in my seat. The flight attendants wrapped the man's body in blankets and put a pillowcase over his head. I didn't think that was any way to treat a dead man, but I recognized that they had no other option, just as I had no other option but to accompany him to our destination. For the rest of the flight, I couldn't do anything but think about my life.
That was great.
Thanks.
I love that part. Do we want to fill the seats that are open up here before we get started? There are like 4 seats open if 4 of you want to take them. So, hi.
Hi.
It's such a pleasure to be asked to be the interlocutor for this book. As you heard, it is very funny, very weird, and very surprising. It's one of the most exciting debut novels I've read in a long time, and I really love it.
Thanks.
So, if you haven't read it yet, you're in for a treat. I'm going to ask questions for maybe 25 minutes, and then we'll take some from you. So do think about what you might want to ask. I'll try not to steal your questions psychically. I only ask this question at book launches because I think it's a lazy question, but I think it's allowed one time at your launch event, which is, where did this book come from?
It's such a good question. And when I am asked this question, I feel like I have to sort of like invent a past version of myself who was thinking things actively, because actually the process of writing it was, I mean, we talked about this before, it was kind of impulsive, and the things that conditioned it are things that don't necessarily feel interesting to talk about. Like, I had just moved out of my apartment, I was living out of my car, I was at a residency, all of those things were enabling. They don't necessarily manifest in the book in ways that would be palpable to a reader. But for the purposes of answering your question today, I will say I was thinking a lot about refuge. A lot of my family came to the States as refugees, and I was thinking about the process of seeking refuge, which I tend to think of as an individuating process. Legally, when people are seeking refuge, they have to argue their belonging to some collective, usually, that's experiencing persecution either by the government or by a group that the government can't control. But nevertheless, saving one's life requires leaving the collective life that sort of serves as the premise of refuge behind. So I was thinking a lot about that, and also thinking about the language that tends to attend refuge, which is, in the US, a political term. It's a term that has shifting meaning depending on the relationship between the US and the various countries that refugees are coming from. But nevertheless, it tends to connote safety, livelihood, life itself, especially in distinction to a country of origin, which again, in the legal context, must be a site of persecution and potential death. So I was thinking a lot about those sort of binaries that are set up in the legal system, and how for Black people that are seeking refuge in the States, there's a kind of obvious paradox, just because the States can't be a site of safety. So that it was kind of, I guess, not front of mind while I was writing, but has been sort of like percolating and conditioning for my life, the duration of my life, whether or not I've been thinking about it actively. So that's one place where it came from.
And so the book has this amazing style, and you heard a little bit of it. It has word repetitions beyond, I think, the usual. It has beautiful haze. One of my favorite sentences is right here. I slept for days, at least a few hours. What a weird, I looked at it for like 5 minutes. And I read an interview with you, and I was clocking this partially, but not fully, that there are no metaphors.
Yeah.
And so this style repetition, no metaphors, these kind of circling sentences. Was it there from the beginning? Did it evolve as you wrote?
No, that was mostly there from the beginning. I think there were probably a few metaphors in the first draft, but as I was writing, it became clear to me that the narrator did not have a writerly sensibility. He's obviously a narrator of his own life, but he's also a reluctant narrator, and he's very resistant to the kinds of meaning making that happens in language, that must happen in language. And given that he's a reluctant narrator of his own life, given that he isn't one to willingly relinquish reading to or meaning to a reader, I had to kind of find ways for the reader to glean meaning kind of surreptitiously or sneakily, and repetition felt like a way to do that. And I mean, metaphors are kind of a quick way to produce meaning. They wear their symbolism clearly, and I was interested in trying to work with symbolism that I guess was a little bit more hidden, and that necessarily came through repetition. Like there are lots of sort of identifying objects that appear in the text and reappear and get lost and then appear again. So yeah, things like that.
There's also, I mean, I also want to separately ask, I always think metaphors are one of my great lazy maneuvers as a writer, so it seems like you made a challenge for yourself.
Yeah, well, I don't love metaphors. Wow. No, I do love them. When there's a good metaphor, it's good, but I often don't like them.
Good to know. So beyond metaphor, another thing you're not doing is like names of things, not just names of characters, but like names of food, names of place with limited exceptions. So was that also like? Can you talk a bit about why you're not naming like films? Like the film you had,
right.
Food, anything else in the book?
Yeah, again, like it's something that sort of started impulsively and then started to feel true to the narrative that was building. But I think, I mean, there was a defensive thing. Like I didn't want to write something that could be read sociologically, I guess, even though I am throughout referencing histories that are real in my mind that I've gleaned from stories that I've been told, that I've gleaned from reading and research that I've done. I didn't want to write something that could be read sociologically, and I also was I was really interested in these sort of like these site-specific ideas that are typically attended by lots of proper nouns, things like refuge, things like a home country, things like I don't know, like living in exile, like all of those things are typically weighed down or tethered at least to the real world geographically, and yeah, through proper nouns. And I was interested in those things as kind of like relational nodes, as opposed to places that are located specifically in space. I was interested in how people conjure them together intimately, and so strangely, I guess, not using proper nouns felt like a way to actually be specific about how these things come into being. And yeah, the narrator, he is traveling from a country to another country, but I was much more interested in how that country is evoked through fantasy, through lived experience, through projection. I wanted to write about that, which again is not to say that the country in the text doesn't have a history. It does have a history that's referenced throughout, and that also conditions the lives of basically everyone who's in it, whether they're like indigenous to the country or they're temporarily working.
That makes total sense. And within this idea is also this question of translating oneself for others. In the section you read, there are multiple languages, and you kind of mark when people are switching. And I was trying to track how many languages are in this book. I mean, there's like at one point a mysterious twins language that only twins and a mother speak, and so you constantly are sort of marking when there's a linguistic switch happening without giving any language. And I was fascinated by that, and I don't think I'd quite seen it before the more I looked at it.
Yeah, I think that started, I mean, obviously, I wrote the book chronologically, so I think the first instance of it is the instance that I read where the flight attendant is switching. Well, no, I guess there's one before then, but when the companion that he's with on the plane doesn't speak what's become the language, become the language of the plane, and then there's another switch with the flight attendant. I mean, language is like so conditioning. Like there are anyone I think who speaks multiple languages know that basic things that are experienced in the world, which should be kind of like tangible and unchanging, or that's kind of the myth of them, are in fact revealed not to be when they're described in other languages. I mean, it can happen within a singular language too, like the distance between an object and the language that's used to attend it is vast, and I think probably every writer is dealing with that, with like language as a kind of failed representational tool. So yeah, I was interested in that when I was writing, and interested in the various levels of like reality building that could happen through these various languages, which are referenced but never actually described for their qualities.
I think that's really fascinating and kind of speaks to why this book is so interesting, because you're dealing with both this amazing plot, which I want to talk a bit about, and also sort of the ideas that would come with a plot like that. And you're really developing ideas alongside your plot. The plot to me felt akin to maybe a picaresque book. I was thinking of like Planes, Trains, and Automobiles when I was just constant movement.
Yeah.
I think Katie Kitamura said it was kind of like North by Northwest in her review for the Times. And so you're in like this constant motion, and like a good picaresque, your character is hearing all these stories. And so this tradition of storytelling was very interesting to me in this book. Also, I mean, Julian Lucas comped it to Rachel Cusk, except the person dies, which I thought was on the plane at the beginning. So what is this impulse of storytelling that you're dealing with in this book? Everyone this person encounters talks to him, and sometimes at great length, and he's usually not thrilled about it.
Yeah, he's not thrilled about it. I mean, I feel sort of like competing impulses around storytelling. Like I've personally learned a lot through storytelling. I mean, I like I said, I'm really invested in like language and narrative as failed representational tools, and the fact that they fail is something that is like very painful to me. But nevertheless, it's what I've chosen to try to find meaning in. So but I have learned a lot of storytelling. I come from a family of storytellers, and I think most of the sort of like ethics that I've learned to embody in the world have come through sort of like generational storytelling. And so part of the impulse to write the book in this way is also an impulse to record the stories that I've been told. I have a deep fear of forgetting things that sort of feels like gnawing every day. And so writing is a way to combat that. And if I can publish it and other people can read it, it feels like even more ensured that these stories won't be forgotten. But in terms of the narrator, he's really divided against himself. He wants desperately to know what he is under, what he's going through, and he knows that other people might contain the answers to what he's going through, and yet he seems unable to read in their compulsive storytelling anything that could tell him about his life. He's really attached to his sense of self as a sovereign individual, so he doesn't want to believe that anyone who's just describing what's been happening with them, either in their personal history or in their own psychology, he doesn't want to believe that could tell him anything about himself. And of course, if you read the book, it does. Like he is connected to other people. I think like even when you're interacting with a stranger on the street who maybe doesn't share biographical details with you, and there is no reason for your encounter happening other than the fact that it's happening. Like those encounters are revealing, and they do, I don't know, they produce life, but I think he's very resistant to that.
And as a reader, you're almost like good frustrated with him. There's this wonderful scene, you capture the horror of eavesdropping on graduate students very well. These two graduate students are having an argument, and I was like getting Stockholm flashbacks. And as I read, and I'm sure as you all will read, gradually I realized that, and I'm not going to spoil anything, but gradually I realized that one of the characters had narrative significance. And you let the reader know that before your first person close narrator knows it. And so there's this interesting estrangement I think you're playing with, especially in the second half of the book, between reader and protagonist.
Yeah, that was difficult. It was difficult. I say that because when I wrote the book, when I started writing it, I didn't know what was going to happen basically at any point. And once I did know, which was, once I knew what was happening, generally, that probably happened like midway through writing it. So I had to go back and rewrite a lot and try to manage when a reader would glean something in tandem with the narrator, who I think we have to rely a lot on the narrator in this text. It's a first person narration, so obviously that's the case. But he's also very insistent on how reality appears, and so I think, I don't know if this was your experience as a reader. It's hard for me to sort of like project how someone else would encounter it, but I do think there are various stages in the text when the reader maybe learns that he can't be trusted so much, but at the same time he contains information that you desperately want. So yeah, I don't know that like really addresses what you were saying.
No, it does.
But, yeah,
because there's this estrangement between us and the character,
Right.
which I find kind of compelling.
yeah,
Now I feel like I'm in the Barbie movie with my next question, but I want to talk about death. And this book, I think America's famously bad about death, right?
Yeah.
We don't handle it well. We're in
Yeah.
like a deep sort of constant denial.
Yeah.
This book deals with the fascinating tradition around death, and also I think, as you heard, what with the person dying, is very invested in concepts of death from the
Yeah.
beginning. So can you talk about death?
Yeah, definitely. Unfortunately, I've been thinking a lot about this since writing this book. I wasn't as I was writing it, and then it affected me deeply. But
Great.
no, what I'll say is I grew up with sort of I would say like competing notions of death. On one side of my family, there were these strong rituals around death that are shared culturally, but basically when someone dies, my family's Ethiopian, when someone dies, it's typically not the case that the person closest to whoever has died will be just told immediately, oh, so-and-so has passed away. Normally their friends and family will gather all together, they'll tell each other first and then tell the person all together. And I sort of witnessed this happening throughout my childhood, and it felt at once like a kind of amazing feat of empathy. It also was very intense and upsetting, and occasionally kind of theatrical. The sort of Tetris that has to happen in order to prepare someone for the knowledge that they're about to begin grieving. It's complicated. It involves, in my experience, a lot of deception that's kind of, like I said, like incredibly empathetic deception, but deception nonetheless that can lead to paranoid reading when you're the person who's being prepared to begin grieving. And my father's been in that situation a number of times. He was told, I remember once he was told when I was a kid that his brother had passed away and he needed to go back to Ethiopia to go to the funeral. And when he got there, he realized that it was not the brother that they had told him, who he wasn't as close to, but in fact this like much closer brother.
Wow.
And so strange things happen. So that was happening kind of all around me when I was growing up. At the same time, I, for some reason, was sort of birthed into the world as an adamant atheist. And that was before I knew all of the like horrible things that I think attend atheism. But I was, for whatever reason, it's kind of a mystery to me, adamant that death was something that happened and then was done. But I was also 5 years old, so I hadn't really experienced that much of it. And as I got a bit older, I realized that maybe that wasn't going to serve me, and in fact, that was like it was conjecture, obviously, but it was also a way of reading the world that was very closed off and unemotional. And I think when I was writing the book, I was I was coming out of having experienced a sort of intense version of the sort of rituals of mourning that I was describing earlier, and trying to figure out how to think about death, I guess, as someone who didn't grow up with a strong tradition of understanding what death is and what happens after it.
I love this idea that like there's something beautiful about gathering everyone, and there's something sort of horrible about deception, and so it's all totally working here. And there's this big open mystery about the brother in the book who is dying, who's really not quite addressed, and I thought all that was terrific. One thing I was interested by in the book, I think books are often sort of accumulative, like characters are injured and then they walk with a limp from then on in, or they get a scar. And this character gets a horrible leather jacket early in the book that he can never quite get rid of. But like, we have some readers in the audience. But other than that, like, he is essentially experiencing a shedding of belongings. And you do a great job sort of inventorying is not a word, his belongings at the start of the book, and then sort of getting rid of them as you go. So can you talk about that a bit? Because it was so technically beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say first, and this is maybe not so relevant to your question, but after writing this book, I became very superstitious that I had like willed bad things into the world.
That's relevant.
And I recently took a flight and I left on the plane my bag with my wallet, my passport, my keys, everything.
God.
And I was really freaking out about it. And I was like, the character in my book would be very, very calm about all of this happening. Well, I mean, I think it goes back to what I was saying about him being so attached to his individualism. All of the things that are sort of cataloged at the beginning as belonging to him are markers of him as an individual moving in the world. Like, and you know, these lists appear throughout. He has his wallet, he has his passport, he has, at a certain point, he has maybe his blood pressure medication.
Not clear.
Yeah, unclear. And then this jacket that kind of haunts him. He has things that he doesn't want. This jacket, his beard is growing and he can't really shave it. But he's desperately kind of grasping on to some sense of himself as an individual in the world, which is conditioned by his life in America. And he wants desperately, when he goes home, to return to some collective. And I had said before that he doesn't have a writerly sensibility, but he does have a sense for how stories should go, and he knows that the story, this is said explicitly in the book at one point, he knows that the story of the immigrant returning to his home country should be a good one. And he kind of wants to will that story into the world, even as he knows that that's not the way things are going. And I think that's kind of like localized within his attachment and loss and kind of passive loss of all of these things that are sort of meant to outwardly tether him to a sense of self.
And that line you just named, I'll just read it because it's really beautiful. He's thinking about emailing home, and it says, "It wasn't accurate, but it didn't need to be accurate because emails were just a mode of storytelling. In the case of the so-called immigrant returning to his home country, the story should be a good one." And so I'm interested that deception is on both sides. He's also, well, the emails aren't sending, but he's trying to send emails home. And America here is represented wonderfully by TV news. And TV news sort of functions as this choral effect in the book, where every now and then he turns in. So can you talk a bit about like the American media complex in relation to this?
Yeah. I mean, so there are sort of like multiple tiers of storytelling happening here. There are the stories that the narrator sort of reluctantly tells about himself. He relinquishes them slowly. They're kind of like metered throughout the text. And then there are the stories that, like you mentioned, are compulsively told toward him by the various people he's encountering. But then there are also the stories that appear in the news, and he watches sort of like morning news on TV. He listens to the radio a few times. He also checks the news when he goes to these various internet cafes to check his email. And he really, I think, reads the news as a form of entertainment, and he does that consciously. He says, and he's talking about the news from his home country in particular, like this news is produced as a mode of entertainment, which I think is true for how a lot of us encounter the news, like even news that is horrible. I think people tend to, and this is particular, I think, to Americans and Europeans probably. I don't know any of them. But they probably likewise read the news as these kind of like accessory stories that appear in our daily lives but don't seem to intersect with it, even when the news is local. And I think that that's a very bad way of reading the news, but it's also conditioned by the way that it's presented. And the narrator is struggling with that at a certain point. When he's at the internet cafe, he sort of tires of reading news about seemingly random stuff that's happening in his home country, and he searches his brother's name on the news site, and of course he finds nothing because, as he says, the news is not really meant to address ordinary people. I don't think that's how news stories actually work. I think that they're deeply enmeshed with how we all experience our own lives, and that winds up being true for the narrator as well.
Not to spoil anything.
Yeah.
I'm gonna maybe do one more from me, and then we'll turn to you. So do think about questions. Okay, I wanted to talk about like recognition, essentially. So like in Greek myths, there's this thing called anachronesis, which is when you realize what something really is. So like Oedipus is like, oh my God, not just have I fucked my mother, but I killed my dad, and I actually am someone I didn't know I was either, and I'm actually in my home, I guess I'm spoiling Oedipus, and I'm actually like in my home country, and I gotta blind myself.
Yeah.
But it's okay because my mom had a magic necklace. So like, this book has so many moments of what's called this like technique, anachronesis, where like, there's a car. I'm taking one that's not really a bad spoiler. Like there's a car, and then he's like, I think that's my car from when I lived here 25 years ago, or a house, or various family members. And so can you talk a bit about this like technique of recognition and this interest I think you have in it?
Yeah. Well, this is maybe like the least interesting answer, but that is how I experience the world. I tend to like not.
That's interesting.
Well, I mean, it's hard to know the significance of things as they appear. Like it's really difficult, or even like, I don't know, maybe there are people who are completely like self-conscious and are able to act, and they know what meaning the action is going to produce. I tend to like act, and then like 5 years later be like, oh, that changed me, and that changed my relationships to people and how I form relationships in general. So yeah, I mean, I'm also like nostalgic, and like I said, I'm like obsessed with memory. So that's all conditioning. But what else was I going to say? What else was I going to say about that?
We could circle back.
Oh, no, I mean, I was going to say too, I mean, this is again something that has interested me after writing the book, and it's not something I was writing about so consciously, but there is obviously a tradition in Anglophone lit of characters who act in accordance with who they are, and who are kind of like consciously taking action in the world, and aware of their psychologies as they're sort of being warped by the built environment. I mean, that like embodies like all the post-enlightenment like ideals of humanism or whatever, and that is something that I find to be like deeply like kind of untruthful and pernicious. So I guess like retrospectively, I did feel an impulse to sort of write against that. Yeah.
That's great. I think you succeeded in that impulse. Okay, so let's take questions. I have to repeat your question for Webb. So whatever you say, bear my poor memory in mind. We're both teachers, so we will wait forever for a question. We will not be frightened by dead air. Yes.
So you were talking about, this difference between like refugee and a refuge, and also like the politics of representation and the sense of belonging, and also like trying to critique the American media. Through these how much did those influence you in terms of like when you were sitting down to like approach writing?
So, like, how did academic studies like Black feminism or post-colonial thought influence you as you sat down to write this book?
Oh, I mean, it's this kind of stuff is so difficult to trace. I mean, that like those are bodies of thought that in some ways have become the atmosphere, it feels like, that I'm moving through. It was rare. It actually never happened that I was consulting something and then writing, or consulting something and writing even at like the same time. But I think most often what was on my mind, I mean, it's so tricky to sort of navigate the relationship between theory and experience. Like that's why theory is so pleasurable for me, at least to read, is because it feels like it conjures experience, but then presents it in a way that's like at once so seismic and tangible, and then it starts to shape reality. So I find those things really difficult to trace, but I was thinking a lot about the failure, I guess, of the legal provision of refuge, and that is something that I studied. Like I studied refugee law, and I was thinking about that in the context of my family, who has lived in what gets called a refuge in the States. I mean, technically, refuge is meant to be like a temporary condition that people pass through, and I think after they pass through it, they have to, and I'm talking particularly about Black immigrants and people who come here as asylees and refugees, the ways that they have to produce the conditions of refuge themselves. And that's something that I have a kind of theoretical interest in, but I only know anything about it because I've lived among people who are sort of doing that on a habitual daily basis. So yeah, I don't think that fully answered your question, because it's always a strange alchemy that's difficult to trace. But for sure, everything that I read and everything that I experience, they feel like they shape reality equally.
Can you talk a little bit about the book you think you set out to write, and then the one that came to be? Because you mentioned the experience of midway through I found X, versus the experience of that.
Can you talk a little bit about the book you set out to write versus the book that came to be?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't know that I was writing a book, really. I was like just having fun. So it's hard to answer. I mean, I think it wasn't until I finished it that it was a book at all. And even then it wasn't a book because it wasn't an object. It was just like a document on my computer. It was just like a diary, essentially, like thoughts that had taken written form. So I think I still am not sure, because I'm still sort of in that midway point. I'm not really sure what the book became. I'm starting to like glean it. I mean, I'm being kind of untruthful. Obviously, I have some idea of the book, but it does genuinely change just by I don't know. Once I hear from readers who luckily have been telling me what it is.
You said something so interesting beforehand. You said, "I'm never going to get to read it."
Oh yeah, I was complaining about that before. Yeah,
Very
yeah. No,
interesting.
I don't get to read it. It's sad. I mean, I'm curious if there are novelists who feel like they get to enjoy their novels as novels. You said maybe when I'm 90. Yeah, I hope I make it there. Yeah, no, I don't get to enjoy it as a novel, unfortunately. I can pick it up and enjoy little pieces, but I don't really have a sense of, or I don't get to sort of like relinquish my sense of self and let it wash over me in the way that I do get to do when I read novels that weren't written by me.
Other questions? So many half hands. Yes.
Hi Maya.
Hi.
I found it fascinating as a reader to sort of experience a narrator that seemed distinctly unable to be embarrassed, and in fact an emotion that seems kind of absent from the text and the narrative is like a sense of shame.
Yeah.
And I find that really interesting because then you also can't feel guilt. And the narrator is deferring that feeling constantly because there's a lot to be guilty about because he left the country that he's going to, and he's going to visit his brother who he doesn't see and he keeps ignoring. I was wondering why you felt like the need to evacuate all those emotions, because I think that's what produces the estrangement that I was talking about. Sorry if you have to summarize that.
The evacuation of shame and guilt.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. He doesn't feel shame. He doesn't feel guilt. He doesn't even really, I mean, at a certain point he feels sadness, but it's really belated. Yeah, but he is very polite. He's very, very polite. He knows what he's supposed to say when he's supposed to say it, and he does carry out those conventions of respectability. He's very, very attached to his sense of self as a respectable man in the world. And I think, I mean, I was interested in the idea of someone who was so attached to these conventions of social behavior that the conventions themselves were vacated of meaning because, yeah, the conventions were the things. And I think because of that, he feels intensely the boundary between himself and other people. He's not a vulnerable person at all. And I think feelings of shame and guilt require some kind of openness to other people's experience of the world. And he's able to demonstrate a kind of theoretical openness through the habits of polite behavior. But again, he's sort of so obsessed with the conventions that he isn't able to feel that much.
Two more.
I remember feeling when I was reading, like, wondering, was this a man at all? And did he have a gender? And I'm wondering if you can speak to, like, in what ways he's masculine or not, or like how that relates to unfeeling or feeling.
So as this questioner started reading and maybe continued reading, was this a man? And this question about how gender kind of plays into the writing of this character or ungendering.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to think of him as a man, though I think I understand why you question it. Well, he's very, I mean, it's hard. So you know, he does exhibit conventional masculinist behaviors. He doesn't really address any of the women who are around him, even though they're the ones who are kind of helping him along his journey. They give him medicine, they give him food, but he's kind of basically uninterested in them. Though he does have a kind of strange relationship to his own sexuality and sexual interests. He, I think because he's so kind of walled off from other people, he isn't able to maybe express lust in the way that hopefully most of us are able to. So I guess that is not that's not conventionally masculine behavior, but he is. I think it is a product of something that begins as masculine behavior, which is an unwillingness to be vulnerable to others. But yeah, he doesn't. I mean, I think it's not just like sexual too. Like he doesn't experience pleasure. He doesn't like. He likes eating, but unfortunately, all the food he encounters is really disgusting.
And he's constipated.
Yeah, and he's
horrible.
constipated.
He's the most constipated character.
Yeah, he has bad constipation.
That's insane.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
had a question about that, but I don't have time. Okay, one more from the audience, please. Yes.
So as you guys have talked about, obviously the book deals with these really heavy topics like death and refuge and everything, but it's also like an incredibly funny book.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering, while you were writing it, like, was that something that like you kind of felt that push and pull, or like kind of how did like the funny aspect of the book kind of work its way into the subject matter?
So thanks for asking this because of the one I didn't have time to ask myself. The question is, besides all the heavy subjects we've been talking about, the book is very, very funny. And so how did humor work into your writing, and how did you think about humor?
Yeah. I mean, it like it's all about the voice. So, yeah, I mean, humor, it's hard not to answer this question again, like, circularly, like, it's funny because it's funny. But that is kind of what it is, like, the narrator's funny, and obviously I'm, like, writing jokes when I'm writing, but they're not necessarily the kind of jokes that I make. I had the unfortunate situation, someone who read the book was like, I didn't realize you were so funny. Yeah, it's kind of like, I don't know, like writing humor, it sort of feels like, you know, when you like go to a party or something and you're just like, you're on, people are responding to you. You leave and you're like, I don't really know who that was, but I had fun. And that's kind of what I can only say what it feels like. I don't know. Maybe there are like comedians out there who know where their jokes come from, but for me it just feels like I'm gonna pretend I'm funny for a little bit.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much for coming out tonight. Thank you to everyone who asked questions. Thank you, Adam, for moderating such a great conversation. And thank you to Maya for celebrating this launch with us. So just a few quick notes before we wrap up. We are sold out of books, unfortunately, and fortunately. But if you would like to reserve one or place one on order, please see our booksellers up at the front. And we have little book plates that you can still get signed by Maya so that you can stick those in your books when they arrive. Otherwise, for those of you who do have books, Maya will be signing and personalizing those at the little window next to where you checked in. My coworker Elise and Cameron, they're both pointing at that now. It'll make a lot more sense in a minute. We just ask that you all grab your personal belongings with you, line up down the center aisle, and curve around to the wall. I think that's all. Let's give these two one last round of applause. Thank you all so much.